Let me read to you a passage from the 20th chapter of St John's Gospel, verses 1 and then verses 2 to 8. It's the Gospel for the feast of St John the Evangelist on December the 27th. St John writes, "Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary of Magdala came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved, and said, 'They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put him.' So Peter and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went in. He saw and he believed." That's from John chapter 20, verses 1a, and then verses 2 to 8, for the feast of St John the Evangelist on December the 27th. What does it suggest to us? Well, among other things, we think of the dispositions in the heart of John the Evangelist in arriving at the tomb. What do I mean? Well, each of the four Gospels, of course, report the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and they do it in different ways. Matthew's Gospel has 28 chapters, and the last, consisting of 20 verses, is given to the resurrection account. Mark's Gospel has 16 chapters, and the last, consisting of 20 verses, is given to the resurrection. The two accounts have similarities. Luke's account is more than twice the length of each of those two, with 53 verses given to the resurrection. It is vivid and more extensive in its detail, and in various respects rather unlike the narrative of both Matthew and Mark. Our Gospel passage today for the feast of St John is drawn from the Gospel of St John. In what might have been the original conclusion of the Gospel, chapter 20, 31 verses are given to the resurrection appearances in the vicinity of Jerusalem. In the last chapter, chapter 21, perhaps a subsequent addition to John's Gospel, there are a further 25 verses on the resurrection appearance at the Sea of Tiberias in Galilee. All up, therefore, the Gospel of St John provides us with the fullest account of the resurrection. Further, this account is notable for its living and concrete detail, and in this respect is like that of Luke. Luke informs us that the women told the apostles what the angels had said to them, and that the apostles did not believe. Some Greek manuscripts add the detail in verse 12 of Luke's chapter, that Peter arose and ran to the tomb, and stooping down could see nothing but the wrappings. So he went away full of amazement at what had happened. Other manuscripts, such as the Nestle version, do not have that detail at all, that verse 12. But the event is taken up by John in his Gospel and given vivid detail. Yes, Peter did run to the tomb, as Luke describes, but there was more to it than this. John accompanied his older friend, and both sprinted from their dwelling in Jerusalem to the burial place outside the city. It was early and still dark, perhaps not absolutely dark, for the women had been to the tomb and back. Through the streets they ran, hearts pounding. Both ran at full capacity. The younger man, perhaps barely out of his teens, outstripping the older. The body of Jesus, their master, had gone. Today on the feast of St John the Evangelist, December the 27th, we think of John the Apostle and Evangelist. But in his Gospel, John insists that we think of him as associated with Simon Peter. Reaching the tomb first, he, John, looked inside and saw the burial wrappings on the ground, as if this detail were important. Peter arrived and immediately entered the tomb, and likewise saw the wrappings, with this addition that he also saw the piece of cloth which had covered the head of Jesus. It was rolled up in a place by itself. It is to be noted that the sight by both apostles of the burial wrappings on the ground is given a certain importance. After Peter, the other disciple went in, and, we are solemnly told, he saw and he believed. It looks as if the detail about the burial cloths had something to do with his believing, for the intriguing mention of the former immediately precedes the latter. It might also suggest that the significance of these burial cloths and their position in the tomb was perceived by Christians in the ambience of John's influence, or at least that John considered they would understand it in writing his account. I say this because there is no further explanation in the text, as if John considered that the reader would understand the connection. Well, be all this as it may, John saw, and in some sense, to some degree, he believed. He saw some indications, something about the empty tomb, that led him to believe, perhaps while still requiring the further appearances, but nevertheless belief in the living Jesus had replaced the terrible vacuum of his loss. There was no longer a vast void, and this on the basis of having seen the empty tomb with the wrappings. I cannot help but wonder whether John was pointing out to his reader that even though he had not yet seen the glorious Jesus in the flesh, even though he had but seen the empty tomb and the wrappings, even though he had seen only some indications, some evidence, we might say, that sufficed for some belief. That is to say, the knowledge that Jesus has risen does not require the sight of him that John himself was subsequently granted. What is critically important is the prior disposition of soul, that will enable the hearer to judge correctly the significance of the details of the gospel narrative. At the end of his chapter, John writes that he has recorded the signs performed by Jesus in the presence of his disciples, and this recording of them was meant to help the reader believe in Jesus as the Messiah and Son of God. By and large, we have signs to go on, signs brought to us by the entirely credible witness and testimony of the Church. We do not have a mathematical demonstration. But these signs, if received by one who has the right dispositions of mind, heart and soul, can bring him to absolute certainty, a true faith in Jesus Christ and his resurrection as being a most certain fact. On this feast of St John the Evangelist and Apostle, let us resolve to make his loving dispositions our own.